Hello and welcome to the Intelligence Fusion livecast, where we're looking at extremism in America. It's a really interesting time in the US at the moment with events that are unfolding, and what we'll do is everything that we've spoken about on the lines of extremism, we'll link it back to events in the US at the moment. And the US, it's unique not only in terms of its history, it's also a highly diverse country with massive wealth inequality from region to region. And it's also going through a really interesting time where it's currently the only superpower, but it's being challenged by China. You had the 2008 financial crisis, which has left the country in massive amounts of debt. And then also we've had COVID-19 and then the recent events with the George Floyd's murder. So I will be speaking about the right-wing part of the extremism. Vincent's going to speak about the left-wing side of it. We'll not cover Islamic extremism as part of this live cast, just purely because it's a huge topic to cover. But we may get to it in a future podcast. So, first of all, Vincent, the first thing regarding right-wing extremism that I should kind of point out, and what is quite distinct of right-wing extremism over left-wing extremism, is the idea of producerism. So this is the idea that hard-working producers of America are beset by an elite that's suppressing them from above, as well as a parasitic underclass from below, who are reliant on welfare and government benefits. There are, though, many linkages between right and left-wing issues, mainly surrounding conspiracies for things like population control or the New World Order. So that's going to be a big part of what we speak about today, is the actual whole conspiracy theories that are actual drivers with these groups. So with conspiracy theories, it's a different worldview. It's multiple layers of reality. And with the rise of the internet age, whilst you had the sort of democratization of information, which was a fantastic thing, it also became very evident that there are downsides as part of the internet age. So there was no filter on bad information or fake news. And it also had a huge impact on how people interact. So interacting on the internet, people are kind of distilled down to either an avatar or just a username. And this then became a breeding ground for anger and paranoia, and this very much troll culture that we currently see. When we look at the right-wing extremism and the conspiracies that are part of that, the first one that I want to speak about is the Second Amendment conspiracy. So that's the conspiracy that essentially the government eventually wished to take away the arms of the American population, effectively rendering them defenseless from the government. You've also got the New World Order conspiracy, which very much came to the fore in the 1990s. However, prior to that, you had certain Christian fundamentalist groups who actually believed in this New World Order conspiracy, which is essentially, the common theme is that when it comes to the New World Order, is that it's a secretive power elite with a global agenda that is conspiring to eventually rule the world through an authoritarian world government, which will replace sovereign nations. You've also got the global warming and climate change conspiracy, of which the right, who believe in this, think that it's generally a hoax, or it's created by leftists as part of a wider conspiracy to actually control the general population. You had the Y2k Conspiracy, which was interesting, essentially suggesting that because of the way that computers are set up and moving from the year 1999 to the year 2000, the computers would actually revert back to the year 1900 and cause this mass crash in technology, which didn't come about. However, you had people like Alex Jones who were about in the year 2000, 20 years ago, who were stating that this was part of a New World Order plan in order to actually take over and control the masses. Obviously, with that not occurring, it caused quite a bit of embarrassment for those proponents of the Y2k conspiracy theory. But within a year, you then had 9/11, which just opened up a massive movement of conspiracy theorists. Again, with people like Alex Jones, who were pushing this idea that it was a false flag, committed against the US population in order to allow them to go to conduct these wars around the world, and really feeding into this New World Order plot. There's quite a bit of anti-Semitism, which is brought into the 9/11 conspiracy theory. And it's a conspiracy theory that's believed not just by the right, but it's also on the left, and it's on the Islamic extremist side as well, and can be a driver for certain incidents and attacks. And certain things have occurred which mean that people call into question what the government says. So part of the Iraq war was that the US went to war because Saddam Hussein had WMDs. Now, when that was proven to not be the case, you then had people who were questioning the government's motives, but also the ability to actually believe what they were saying, which kind of feeds into this conspiracy movement. And then the Reconquista Conspiracy, which is that a wave of Latinos are part of a plot to return America's Southwest to Mexico. And you did have the event in El Paso in Texas, where Patrick Crusius, who murdered 22 people, he was trying to stop a Hispanic invasion, but he was also actually linked to this this eco-fascism idea, which is essentially that you can't have nationalism without saving the environment, actually conserving the environment. So it kind of feeds into the environmental movement. And then finally, you've got things like the Obama presidency. So President Obama came into power in 2009. And there were lots of people who were questioning whether or not he was actually a US citizen, foremost of those being President Donald Trump, suggesting that he was born in Kenya, but also suggesting that he was part of some Muslim plot to bring Islam to dominance within the world and in the US. And then more recently, conspiracies that you've seen are the things like the 5G conspiracy theory, the whole lockdown as part of COVID-19, where you've seen certain groups actually come out and push back against these lockdown measures and forcing the government and the police to sort of step down and allowing people to reopen businesses because they're attending armed and kind of forcing and allowing businesses to open through force of arms. So do you want to just go through the different conspiracies that we see on the left wing?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, just like you said previously, some of these conspiracies, like the New World Order, is not just left wing or right wing. It kind of attracts people from both sides of the spectrum. But some of the following conspiracy theories that I'll mention have kind of been predominantly kind of on the left. So like you just mentioned, the 5G conspiracy theory, and that conspiracy theory states that radiation from mobile communication towers are actually harmful to the human body on a molecular level and is impacting the immune system. And so this has been linked more recently to COVID-19 in terms of 5G being linked to the spread of the pandemic thanks to 5G technology. And that's kind of started because China rolled out a 5G network around the same time as kind of the pandemic broke out. And so people made that connection. It's also been linked to another conspiracy theory in regards to Bill Gates, in that he would use COVID-19 as an opportunity to implement microchips in people as a means of controlling the masses. And so, yeah, so that's kind of been the most, at least right now, been kind of the most predominant in regards to the whole COVID-19 pandemic. Another conspiracy theory has kind of been the anti-vaccine movement. So this surrounds the reluctance and hesitancy of people to vaccinate their child because it claims that vaccines have mercury or aborted fetal cells within them, as well as links with between vaccines and autism. Although that's been debunked, but these people who follow this conspiracy theory still believe these things, and these are just some of the items, but there's other issues surrounding this movement. We've also had Russiagate, and that was surrounding President Trump, and it was the whole idea that Trump was controlled by people in the Russian government who might have compromising information regarding him.
Yeah, this was the Steele dossier, wasn't it?
Exactly. So this whole Russiagate conspiracy theory led to a special prosecutor investigation, which looked at the links between Trump's campaign and Russia. And while Trump never faced any charges, or there was never kind of hard links being made, a number of his associates were in fact indicted by this special prosecutor. Finally, and similar in a way to the New World Order conspiracy theory you just talked about, is kind of a theory that there's a 1% controlling the 99%, and this 1% is driven by greed. So in this theory, several families control the media, the halls of power, in order to dedicate to a corporate takeover of a political system. So it's linked to movements like the Occupy movement, but it's also led, like the New World Order, you mentioned anti-Semitism. It's also led to that because of the belief that Jews control the media, the banking system, and other important positions of power.
I mean, it's when you come to conspiracy theories, and this is part of the issue with the internet, is that people essentially go into their echo chambers. And the way that the algorithms work in certain social media platforms is that you just get fed this constant stream of additional information, which kind of matches what you're already looking for. So people get into this echo chamber and then they don't receive these alternate viewpoints that actually question whether or not this is actually true or not.
And we've seen that. You mentioned social media websites. So now with Twitter or Facebook attempting to kind of maybe suppress some of these viewpoints, we've seen some of these followers, particularly right-wing followers, move to kind of other platforms to get away from Facebook, to get away from Twitter, to where they feel their speech is more free and less controlled by these technology companies, which they probably link more closely to one side or the other.
Yeah, I mean, you've got like Gab and Minds and sort of BitChute as alternatives. And what you've certainly seen is almost this feeling of the politicization of social media companies and the media as well, which is, with Trump's whole fake news campaign has meant they've come in for a lot of vitriol and malice from his supporters, and can eventually come to it as part of these protests. But also, the likes of CNN, they've came into again. There's violence been directed against news media organizations as part of the current protest that we're seeing.
It's been quite seen recently with Twitter putting hiding one of Trump's tweets and putting a disclaimer. So talking about the politicization of social media, I think that's a great example and a recent example of it. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah. So let's kind of now move on to the actual movements and the ideas on the right. And we're going to kind of start off with just sort of the general right wing and then move all the way to the sort of lunatic fringe as part of that. And we'll do the same for the left. So the Trump movement has to be explained. So I mentioned before that Trump, he was a birther, believing that President Obama was not born in the US and was wanting to see his birth certificate. You then had the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Trump was humiliated by President Obama, who basically stated that, should he move on to other conspiracies now, like the Roswell incident and the moon landings? And essentially, Trump was almost sort of humiliated into running for the presidency. And off the back of that, Trump became the US's most prominent birther, which sort of ingratiated him with the conspiracy community, but also people who actually disliked Barack Obama. And then when Trump actually formally announced his candidacy, he would take aim at groups like the Mexicans or Muslims, and he would appear on shows like Alex Jones' InfoWars, and he was stating that he felt that the election would be rigged in Hillary Clinton's favor. Now, eventually, obviously, he won the election and became president, and people on the right actually took credit for helping him get into the presidency. So the likes of Richard Spencer, who actually coined the term alt-right in 2009, he tweeted just after Trump won the presidency of stating that the alt-right is now deeply connected to the Trumpian populism, more so than conservative movement, and with the establishment now. Now, analysts who are actually examining the election state that Trump rode to the presidency on a wave of blue-collar economic anxiety resulting from persistent unemployment, but also he had a lot of support in areas which had seen real powerful demographic changes. And the day after the announcement that Trump had won the election, there were nationwide protests. There were protests in 25 cities. You saw groups like the Black Bloc who actually protested and conducted violence in places like Oakland and Portland. And just before the inauguration, you had groups like the Oath Keepers who were warning that communists were attempting to actually overthrow the US before the inauguration day. Alex Jones was saying that the likes of anarchists were attempting to create the largest riot in US history on the day of inauguration. And I can remember us actually watching the event because we were conscious and wondering, was this actually going to happen? It was real sort of vitriol and malice against the Trump becoming president. So we were monitoring to see if that would actually happen. And there wasn't that much violence on the inauguration. What I would say, though, is when it comes to Donald Trump, it's a good level reactionism. What Donald Trump has done through him actually being elected as president, if nothing else on the right, has actually he's empowered certain right-wing groups, because one, he's talked about issues that historically politicians either wouldn't speak about or they would speak about in court.
Yeah, he's brought many of these issues to the mainstream, I would feel like.
Yeah, and we'll kind of get onto it, but I mean, when we talk about the Overton window, this sort of window of political discourse, prior to this, there were certain issues that wouldn't or weren't kind of seen as being allowed to be spoken about. Other movements that I want to talk about, one is the constitutionalists, who believe that most constitutional powers reside in local government, specifically county sheriffs, and not the national constitution. You've also got groups like sovereign citizens who, yes, sit on the right and probably sit on the left as well. Now, these essentially are a loose grouping of American and Commonwealth litigants, commentators, tax protesters, and financial scheme promoters. And they see themselves as answerable only to their particular interpretations of the common law and not subject to any government statuses or proceedings. And you see quite a few videos of people being pulled over by the police in the US and refusing to open up the windows and be arrested because they're stating that as sovereign citizens, they're not liable to the law that the police are trying to enforce, normally resulting in the window being broken and then being dragged out of the car. But moving on, we've also got militia movements, groups like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters. Now, Lawrence D. Pratt, he's considered to be the godfather of the militia movement that really exploded in the 1990s. And you had people like Richard Mack, who would travel the US giving seminars on how to resist the New World Order by resisting gun control measures and also forming militias in order to prepare for self-defense. It's interesting, though, when you look at anti-government and patriot groups, depending on what party is in power, depends on the size of militia groups that are actually operating in the US. So with Bill Clinton, during his presidency, I think you had a high of sort of mid 800 militia groups. That then reduced, and then with President George W. Bush, it sat around the sort of mid 100 quantity. Then with President Obama coming into power, that really spiked, and I think you got up to sort of 1,300, 1,360. And then that's kind of tailed off through the Trump presidency, and it's got this sort of steady decline. So amongst these militias, you've got other groups like Oath Keepers, which was founded by Stuart Rhodes. Now, they're an anti-government group. Generally, they're labeled as far right. And what I find with the right is that there is, I don't particularly agree with certain labels that certain right-wing groups are given. So they give groups like Oath Keepers generally label of far right, but that's kind of lumping them in with neo-Nazis and real sort of essentially ethno-nationalists, which I think kind of muddies the water on the right. So the group, the Oath Keepers, describe themselves as a non-partisan association of current and former military, police and first responders who pledge to fulfill the oath that all military and police take in order to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. You've also got the 3 percenters, and 3% represents the belief that only 3% of the American population actually fought against the Kingdom of Great Britain. And the SPLC categorized the 3 percenters as, again, an anti-government group. Now, some analysts in Canada, where the 3 percenters are actually present as well, consider the group to be the most dangerous extremist group in Canada. You've also got other groups like Patriot Prayer and Proud Boys. And these essentially grew out of the actions of the likes of Antifa and the Black Bloc. So you had conservative events, conservative commentators who were trying to hold events, and they were being interrupted, and there was violence at the events against people trying to actually attend those events. And you ended up seeing groups like Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys actually grow out of that violence. So Patriot Prayer, they were founded in 2016 by Joey Gibson. And Gibson said that he became an activist after seeing a brawl between supporters of the Trump presidency and counter-protesters. And the BBC state regarding Patriot Prayer that they've been connected to the alt-right as well as other far-right groups, whereas Gibson denies this and states that they are neither white nationalists or alt-right and that they support freedom, love, and peace. The Proud Boys, in comparison, so they were actually founded by Gavin McInnes, who was a former founder of Vice, and eventually Gavin McInnes actually came into quite a bit of sort of negative press over the Proud Boys and sort of the actions that they were taking. And he actually eventually left the movement. However, they do still exist. Kind of moving on to the more extremes of the right wing, you've got groups like neo-Confederates. So these are far-right Southern ideologues who argue that the cause of the South was just, and they agitate for modern-day secession. And also organizations like the League of the South and the anti-black, who are an anti-black hate group, and the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, who were formerly a legitimate Southern heritage group that was believed to have been hijacked by neo-Confederates. Alt-right and the alt-right is probably the key one that most people think about when they think about the right in the US. So generally the difference is the alt-right are ethno-nationalists. So, you know, you have to be white to be part of that movement. The alt-right, you have quite a lot of black and Asian people who are part of that movement, who are more civic nationalists. Now, the alt-right, it's an abbreviation for alternative right, and they're essentially a loosely connected far-right white nationalist movement that's based in the US. and it's largely an online phenomenon. On the alt-right, it originated in the US in the 2010s, and they're very much linked to this idea of this angry white victimization culture and open racism, also anti-Semitism, ethnic hatred, misogyny, and sexual and gender paranoia. The alt-right was essentially the far right rewired and digitized for the 21st century. Certain other movements have been linked to the alt-right, so movements like Gamergate, where essentially the gaming community or parts of the gaming community felt that leftist movements were trying to encroach on their sort of hobby area and try and force SJW ideas into the gamer group. And then you've got movements like the Manosphere, which essentially believe in conspiracies regarding feminists and women who are plotting to oppress males, and this being a part of a larger left-wing conspiracy regarding control and the destruction of the Western civilization. Now, Andrew Anglin, who is the founder of the Daily Stormer website, he stated regarding the alt-right that their core ideology is composed of anti-Semitism and white countries for white people, scientific racism, so looking at things like IQ and race, and the endorsement of white history and common sense economics, as well as the view that the white struggle is a global battle. And this kind of comes to this concept of the shifting of the Overton window, just why I kind of touch on the Daily Stormer. So the Daily Stormer is a neo-Nazi website, and similar to National Action in the UK, who actually said in their conferences, you know, the reason why we are so extreme is because we're trying to shift the Overton window, this window of political discourse, so that if we kind of are so overtly neo-Nazi, when people start talking about potential solutions like white nations, these sound a lot more reasonable in comparison than what is being sort of said on sites like the Daily Stormer. You've also got groups like the Traditional Workers' Party. So this was a far-right neo-Nazi group who were active in the US between 2013 and 2018. Established by Matthew Heimbach under the name the Traditional Youth Network, the group promoted white separatism and a white supremacist view of Christianity. And then, of course, finally, you've got the probably the most well-known is the Ku Klux Klan, which has had three distinct eras, probably now sits at around a few hundred to a few thousand members, and very much are hold reactionary positions such as white nationalism and anti-immigration. So those are the movements on the right. There are far more of them. You know, it's essentially like, you know, you have a movement that is a branch of a tree, and then you've got multiple other branches that come off it. But those are sort of the core ones. Do you want to just take us through the actual left-wing movement and groups that are on your side?
Yeah, so I think in regards to left-wing extremist groups, they were quite present and active in the 1970s, and I think that's when organizations like the FBI saw them as quite a threat. But that threat, the FBI said, kind of diminished in the early 90s when right-wing extremists kind of gained more power and more traction and became the dominant domestic terror threat, according to the FBI. Many of these groups on the left share similar ideologies regarding anti-fascist, anarchism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and kind of differing from Islamic terrorism or even right-wing terrorism, extremism. They don't have as big a religious component. So Islamic extremism obviously use Islam to the extreme in their activities, while Christianity kind of is reflected in a lot, is used by a lot of right-wing kind of groups to kind of justify, I guess, their actions. So one of the main groups on the left when in the 70s was the Weather Underground organization, more commonly known as the Weather Underground. So this group was organized in the late 60s as a faction of the Students for Democratic Society. And their ideology involves things like communism, black power, black nationalism, anti-imperialism, and the New Left. And in the early 70s, the group's political views was to create a revolutionary party to overthrow what it viewed as American imperialism to form a classless communist world. So some of the actions included Days of Rage, which was 3 days of direct action in Chicago, which the goal was to protest to end American involvement in Vietnam. And this type of action to denounce U.S. military actions overseas was also seen when the group launched a bombing campaign. So some of their targets included the U.S. Capitol in 1971 to protest the invasion of Laos. The Pentagon was also the target of the bombing in 1972 in retaliation of the U.S. bombing raid on Hanoi in Vietnam. And the U.S. State Department was also targeted in 1975 in response to the escalation in Vietnam. While their bombings primarily caused material damage and not loss of life, but 3 of their members did die while they were preparing a bomb in a townhouse in New York City, and that what they were preparing was thought to be for a mass casualty event to kind of showcase their power. That group kind of began to collapse in the mid-1970s, and a number of their members were arrested, but several groups kind of came out that. One was the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee, where members advocate for the overthrow of the current capitalist system as the only solution to end things like racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and imperialism. A second group that came out of it and that was more violent was the May 19th Communist Organization. So that group was formed by members of the Weather Underground, but also members of the Black Liberation Army, and included members of the Black Panthers and the Republic of New Africa. The ideology involves Marxism, Leninism, anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and anti-sexism. And they had several goals. One was to free those who they perceived to be political prisoners within the United States. So some of their actions included high-profile prison escapes. The second was to appropriate capital wealth to kind of fund their activities in their third phase. And their third phase was to initiate a series of bombings and terrorist attacks. But the way they kind of went to appropriate that wealth was through armed robberies. And so one of their most famous acts was the armed robbery of the Brinks armored truck, where in that process they killed a security guard and 2 responding police officers. In their bombing campaign that followed, the U.S. Senate was also targeted. So we've seen that with the Weather Underground and with this group, government establishments were targeted. And that kind of falls within that ideology of anti-government that we've seen with several groups. Mm-hmm. So back to kind of more recent events, one of the bigger groups is Antifa. So just this week, Donald Trump tweeted that the group would be designated as a terrorist organization, and that follows days of unrest due to the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, with Antifa being blamed for a number of for inciting riots in a number of cities. But then again, you also have people blaming white supremacists for inciting some events as well. The ideology of Antifa is very much anti-capitalist, anti-government, socialist, anarchist with communist views. The group is non-hierarchical, and it acts in various autonomous groups who take their own actions, basically. It's said to be mostly nonviolent, and they claim to be mostly nonviolent, but they're often seen at confronting violently white supremacists or neo-Nazis or fascist groups like Patriot Prayer, like Proud Boys, in cities like Portland and Seattle or New York City, outside the Manhattan Club. So the group organizes itself through a variety of methods via social media, websites, or encrypted messaging apps, and it's grown significantly. It's grown significantly since the election of Donald Trump, probably and primarily as a reaction to the rise of right-wing extremist groups who kind of became slightly more mainstream, and so they grew as a reaction to that to oppose those fascist views. So some of the activities that Antifa is well known for have been the May Day protests, confrontations with Patriot Prayer in the Pacific Northwest. But one of the most significant kind of recent events was the confrontations they've had with white supremacists and neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, Virginia, which led to the death of 1 person and 28 injured when white supremacists drove through a crowd of protesters. And I think that event was, I would say, a catalyst for right-wing extremists in terms of kind of the breaking up of certain groups.
It felt like after the election of Donald Trump that the right were kind of seeing themselves as on the rise, and they held this rally, this Unite the Right rally, where you had a variety of different groups there, from the alt-right to traditional Workers' Party. And you also had sort of militia type people there who were sort of wandering around and trying to kind of maintain peace as well as the police. But yeah, after that attack, it really had an impact on the right-wing groups, and they kind of appeared to be on the decline. The worry is that the current events may mean that they kind of are on the rise again, depending on how this plays out in the US.
Yeah. And so finally with Antifa, a more recent event that I thought was interesting was reports of claiming to have slashed the tires of 8 Amazon trucks at a depot in response to the Amazon workers striking due to a lack of COVID-19 protections and distribution centers around the country. So I think that incident kind of shows the group's capability to target businesses who kind of go against their ideology and anti-capitalism, and Amazon kind of clash. So finally, one of the last groups is kind of the Black Bloc. I would say less of a group and more of a movement, and it kind of represents protesters who dress in all black, face coverings, and who move as one during these events and clash with, similar to Antifa, white supremacists and white nationalists. The group Black Bloc's ideology is associated with anarchism, anarcho-communism, libertarian socialism, anti-fascism, anti-globalization, and one of kind of their events that signified their presence in the U.S. was 1999 anti-WTO protest in Seattle, where the group was involved in the destruction and vandalism of several businesses within the city. So again, kind of like Antifa, showing the capability to be a threat to businesses, particularly retail, in the area. So what I also want to go to in regards to leftist extremist group is those regarding eco-terrorism. So eco-terrorism is those that are committed to support ecological and environmental causes. And the FBI said that between a period of a 5-year period between 2003 and 2008, the group had caused over $200 million worth of damages in some of their actions. Unlike eco-activism, eco-terrorists will resort to means like sabotage or arson. So there's several groups that can be considered within this framework of eco-terrorism. One of them is the Animal Liberation Front, originally from the UK, but then spread to the US. And the group was actually in 2005 added to a planning document by the US Department of Homeland Security, and identifying them as a domestic terror threat. So the group engages in direct action in pursuit of animal rights. This includes breaking out animals from laboratories or farms, as well as damaging, vandalizing, destroying these facilities, and providing animal care and safe houses for the animals they break out. The second group is the Earth Liberation Front. So those are they're either individual or small cells that perpetrate economic sabotage to stop the exploitation and destruction of the environment. So it doesn't particularly have a formal leadership or hierarchy or membership or spokesperson, although at some time some people have claimed to be the spokesperson for a group, with statements coming in anonymously of actions being taken, and often it's these individuals or these small groups perpetrating the actions and leaving a banner with the ALF logo, claiming responsibility for the group, which is kind of the umbrella. So the group is seen to have links with the ALF, particularly due to the cooperation between the two on certain actions. And similar to the ALF in the early 2000s, the FBI saw it as one of the top domestic terror threats. And it's particularly because of their actions. So I mentioned sabotage and arson. So some notable incidents have included the destruction of a ski resort in Vail, Colorado, which caused approximately $24 million worth of damages. We've had SUV dealerships with vehicles being set on fire. We've had condominium development projects in San Diego set on fire as well. One particularly interesting incident and kind of more interesting and linked to kind of today in a way was in 2009 when they set 2 AM radio towers on fire in the state of Washington because they claimed that the AM radio waves caused adverse health effects not only to humans, but were harmful to the environment, to wildlife, and the signals were also disruptive to telephone homes. So I find that that incident's interesting in terms of the current 5G conspiracy theory with people claiming that that has adverse health effects on humans as well. So it'd be interesting to see if now that kind of environmentalism, climate change has become quite widespread and an important issue to the youth of today, whether such groups as the ELF become kind of maybe even more mainstream, and maybe the youth of today find that the action, because governments are reneging on their actions towards climate change, maybe some youth become a bit more extreme in their actions towards trying to implement these actions. So those are kind of the main groups I've mentioned. There's other groups and even could say individual actions such as vegan extremists targeting butcher shops and things of that nature. Yeah. But I think I would say the kind of differentiating factor, it seems, between left-wing extremist groups and right-wing extremists is, it seems there's a bit more kind of about social issues within the left-wing extremist groups in that regard.
I mean, obviously, you know, as an intelligence company, we don't like to just sort of sit and passively take information. Wherever possible, we'll go out and try and get first-hand accounts. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we've attended May Day protest to kind of get a feel for the atmosphere as to kind of what's happening there. You know, we've gone to kind of right-wing events and just kind of listened to the conversations that are being had. And I spoke to a senior leader of Extinction Rebellion, just kind of asked them about the whole situation and kind of where they think things are going to go from, you know, their stand and their goals and aims going forward. And, you know, they were saying, you know, we are a completely non-violent movement. And they basically think that it's going to take a sort of ecological 9/11 for humans to actually do something about the environment and what's kind of happening.
I think kind of COVID-19, a lot of them just from reading and observing have seen kind of COVID-19 maybe as the opportunity for the world to kind of change the way they do things, particularly as when we saw the shutdown of factories across China or across the world, the reduction in pollution, air pollution and things like that. So people seeing the earth kind of heal itself, people, at least on this side of the spectrum, kind of saw it maybe as a potential catalyst for action and change. Yeah. So if that doesn't happen post COVID-19 and we come back to pre-COVID-19 ways and the status quo, will that enrage people further?
And I think, you know, when it comes down to an issue like the essentially the destruction of the earth, how long will people be non-violent for? You know, eventually, surely they're going to go towards direct action if they feel that, you know, non-violent action isn't working. So that's an interesting one for us to monitor. On the left, I'm quite interested in the whole US education establishment, which feels like it's becoming, it's kind of producing radical students as part of it. Kind of two really interesting cases, high-profile cases. You had the Jordan Peterson incident, you had the Brett Weinstein incident. I think it's worth just kind of recapping what happened in those incidents, because it kind of feeds into some of the stuff that we're looking at. So with Professor Jordan Peterson, he was a part of the faculty at the University of Toronto, and it was essentially in relation to Bill C-16, in which it was a law that claimed it would force him to use gender-neutral pronouns, which he refused to do, and then there were protests that followed. Now, he argued that the forced use of pronouns was partly a form of narcissism and also a new rise in the Marxist doctrine. He said it was linked to postmodernism, people who believe that the entire point of human categorization is power, and that dialogue between people is actually a way to actually exchange interpretive viewpoints to ratchet up their dominance and status. Now, for him, biology, or sorry, for the people who believe this, they he believes that biology and science are ideologies, and for them it's all about interpretation. And Jordan Peterson disliked that individuals were forced to be defined by their group identity. And he also believed that when people originally started fighting against unfair discrimination, the idea was to actually eliminate a person being defined by their group. And he felt that that sort of flipped on its head in the 70s. And now you're in a position where you've got social justice warriors and leftists and certain political factions in the US who are completely categorizing people based on their ethnicity or their racial group or their sexual identity. And he argued that essentially this is similar to this class-based guilt that you would see in the Soviet Union. And it allowed the people who operate using this to actually use collective guilt against a group. And with that, he was arguing that you therefore have an entire group that are being blamed for historical actions that they weren't even part of currently. And he goes on to state that 1 in 5 social scientists in the US are Marxists. Marxism being the political and economic theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, later developed by their followers to form the basis of communism. And Peterson was making the point that within the Soviet Union, you had somewhere between 1990 and 1959, between 30 to 50 million people who died as a result of internal oppression in the Soviet Union. And in China, it's anywhere up to 100 million people under Mao's time. And Peterson argues that students have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union generally, so they don't link the ideology with how it actually played out in the real world. And essentially that you have almost this generation that are coming through who are idealistic and want to change the world, and they're looking at topics of environmental issues and wealth inequality, and therefore this ideology is appealing to them, an idea that's at odds with the US system and how it's actually grown as a country. And therefore, universities are creating this radical generation that are coming through who want to see change. The second example was that of Brett Weinstein, where essentially Weinstein was at Evergreen State College. And in 2017, they have this annual event, which is called the Day of Absence. And it's linked to a play that was written by a black playwright, in which events take place in a fictional town where the black population decides not to show up one day in an attempt to emphasize their role in the town, and that the white population are not aware of their role. Now, in 2017, they decided to flip that on the head, and they were asking for the white students and staff not to come into campus on that day. So Brett Weinstein actually wrote a letter to the university, basically saying that a population deciding to absent themselves from a shared space is perfectly fine and reasonable. However, what he felt was unacceptable was somebody or a population that were being forced to be out of a space against their will. That led to numerous protests. He was accused of being racist, and eventually got to a point where you had the actual Evergreen president who was he was trying to speak to the students, and he was accused of having microaggressions in the way he was actually moving his arms. He said that, right, I'm going to go to the toilet, and they were demanding that they escort him to the toilet. So
accused of white supremacy.
Yeah, it just seems the kind of university system in the US seems to be almost a breeding ground for this radical ideology that's kind of coming through.
One thing that's been a point that's been made by people on the right-wing extremists or even right-wing pundits, that the university system in the US breeds this kind of liberal mindset, which kind of they see as the downfall.
So if we kind of bring it back now to the events of the past week and what we're seeing there, certainly from a right-wing perspective, in Minneapolis, I've seen incidents of armed citizens standing guard outside of shops that don't belong to them. They're just standing guard, and they were stating basically that, we're here to, one, protect the shops. We agree with the protest movement. We disagree with the looting, but also stating that they're there to keep an eye on the police and make sure that they are operating honestly. We've also seen groups like Proud Boys being present in Portland, in Oregon, stating that they're there to conduct security. There is quite a lot of blaming going on between the left and the right as to who's actually agitating from these protests. What are you seeing from a left-wing perspective?
Well, we've seen, like we mentioned before, Antifa, even the president kind of blaming Antifa for the incitement of riots within cities in the country, and we've seen videos of black-clad individuals breaking bricks on the ground. But we've also seen that with protesters tackling that person and then handing him over to the police. So it seems like there's a disconnect between the protesters that are there to actually protest the death of George Floyd and people who, with a lot of governors saying that a lot of these rioters are from out of town. So there's outside influences coming in and kind of stirring the pot and inciting these riots. So I think we've also seen coming from these incidents conspiracy theories or potential truth to it, who knows, that the police or outside actors are placing stacks of bricks on the routes of a protest when maybe there's no construction around. So there's this theory that, outside agitators are placing the bricks to then kind of entice people to go out and break shops, things of that regard. So it's a very volatile situation across cities in the U.S. But we've also, talking about Antifa, there's also been blame that they've been paying protesters to actually go out and loot. And so there's been footage, I would say unverified, but of someone handing over cash to a black individual and apparently telling him to go and kind of destroy a shop nearby and things like that. So there's, from what we're seeing in the atmospherics on Snapchat and video coming through Twitter, there's definitely things that are suspect and that kind of support the theory that outside actors are playing a part in these incidents. Because for the most part, the protests are peaceful when they start in the afternoon, and it's usually when the darkness falls that things kick off, and there's rioting and looting and vandalism taking place.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of actual labeling Antifa as a terrorist organization, it'll be interesting to see how that's enforced. You know, with National Action in the UK being prescribed as a terrorist organization, essentially, if you were caught sort of distributing
propaganda and pamphlets and things like
anything related to the group, you know, you could be arrested and charged under terrorism offences. You know, is that what's going to happen with Antifa in the US? Is going to be interesting as to how that plays out. And what is worrying is officers that have been killed as part of these, or during the time of these protests. It hasn't been verified that they're actually linked to the protest groups themselves, but that will come out in the next few weeks and months as the investigations begin. But we have seen incidents like, so one incident where there's a burning police car and there's a protester dressed all in black who's standing there holding a rifle, and you actually had a security guard from a news station run over and point a pistol at the guy's chest and actually disarm him and take the weapon away from him.
And the security guard also had another AR-15 on his shoulder, because I think there were actually two AR-15s taken from patrol cars that were broken down. So I think that's definitely a threat. And I think not only have police officers been targeted, but we've also seen at least one looter in the last few days been killed by a shop owner in that regard. So very volatile situation across the board.
Yeah, and you're seeing another interesting part is you're actually seeing professionals who are being arrested, like those two, I believe they were lawyers who were carrying a Molotov cocktail.
Well, I think through the Molotov cocktail, police officers, and then kind of fled off in a vehicle, but were stopped. And so, and I think that was, I believe, New York City. And so that was, I think, the second incident, because the police had already been targeted by apparently two women who were arrested for having thrown a Molotov cocktail through the back window of a police car where 4 officers were inside. So I think those 2 women were arrested and then are being charged with attempted murder of police officers. So the violence is quite widespread. And I think bigger cities like New York City, Los Angeles, Seattle, Minneapolis, St. Louis, yesterday saw multiple at least 4 police officers shot and wounded. So it'll be an interesting situation in seeing how things develop, because 2016 in Dallas, there were 5 police officers killed by a man who opened fire targeting them after a similar protest march due to the unarmed killing of a black man by police officers. So will these protests and will this action escalate? from one end of spectrum, leading the other end of spectrum to take further action. So like you mentioned, militias or armed protesters guarding shops, will firearms be used even more at a greater frequency in future protests in the coming weeks?
I mean, it's a positive sign to see genuine protesters basically detaining agitators and handing them over to police. It's worrying that police officers are being attacked and potentially killed as part of the protest action. And also, so the 3%ers on their website on the recent blog stated that we will also not respond in the same violent manner. As a member, we encourage you to join or organize peaceful counter protests. Violence should not be our response at this time. And then Joey Gibson of Patriot Prayer stated, we obviously cannot rely on our government. Be patient, but be ready to respond. I highly doubt that these far-left mayors or governors will stop these riots, suggesting that potentially they may get involved themselves if they feel as if the government are unable to stop the protests.
Well, I think in that regard, like we've seen so many times, I think the rhetoric coming from Trump's Twitter feed has also been kind of very divisive and critical of particularly states with liberal, democratic governors or cities with democratic mayors. So further kind of fomenting that those cities and those states can't control. And so if that were to happen, there's already been the National Guard mobilized in several of these states. But if he says if violence doesn't stop, then he'd send in the army. So which would be kind of unprecedented, I would feel, in the U.S. To bring out the army on the streets. So that again, what will that play in terms of the factor of the violence from both sides?
And from a conspiracy perspective, it's you're already seeing people claiming this is how a fascist state is put into place. I mean, from our perspective, so we'll continue to monitor all the events in the US from here in our 24/7 operations center. As a company, we provide subscriptions to our platform so people can actually view this incident data. We also sell our data, and companies can white label our data and sell it on. And we also build bespoke intelligence platforms. So we take our intelligence platform as a foundation, and then we build customized intelligence platforms. So thanks very much for watching our live cast today.